Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. I've just been rereading one of my favorite books, The Big Short by Michael Lewis. You might be more familiar with the movie version starring Brad Pitt and Christian Bale. It's about the 2008 financial meltdown and what caused it. I've been thinking about it a lot this week because there's a banking bill that's working its way through the Senate right now that's designed to roll back a lot of the restrictions that were placed on the banks in the aftermath of that financial crisis. I've been fascinated by the financial meltdown for a long time, in no small part because I graduated undergrad in 2008, right in the heart of the Great Recession. It was a terrible time to try and start your career, as I'm sure many of you know. So when I went to graduate school, I wanted to study it. I wanted to learn why it happened, how it happened, and what steps we were taking to make sure that it didn't happen again. The basics of what you learn in The Big Short is that the financial collapse basically was caused by two things. Number one was the mortgage crisis. There was this idea that you could keep lending money to anybody who possibly wanted to take out a mortgage, even if they weren't likely to be able to pay it back, because real estate prices would continue going up. So if you couldn't pay your first mortgage, you just take out a second mortgage to pay for the first one. At some point, though, that bubble burst. That would have been bad enough, but what really made this such a financial catastrophe, worldwide catastrophe, is because we had so little regulation on Wall Street that the big banks and financial institutions were able to make massive bets on people paying back these subprime mortgages. When they weren't able to do it, it created a trickle effect, a domino effect that caused all sorts of other assets to lose their value at exactly the same time. So it started out as a mortgage bubble, it transitioned into a credit bubble, and they both burst at exactly the same moment. So what we learned from this is that we need to make sure that this reckless speculation on Wall Street is held in check. We can't let banks lend out so much more money, make so much more in promises than they have the ability to actually pay back should everything go wrong. We call that over leveraging. And that's one of the best ways that the government can actually regulate these Wall Street banks. The problem is these banks in mass did over leverage themselves, but we decided as a country that in order to let all of these banks fail, as they should have from all the terrible bets that they made on the mortgage market, if we did that, it would have caused an even greater financial meltdown for the entire country, which is why we decided we needed to bail them out. Nobody liked it. Nobody liked bailing out these big banks that screwed everything up. But we said, all right, we have to do it this time. But what we need to do is take steps to make sure that nothing like this can happen again. We need to break up these big banks. Unfortunately, none of that happened. The people who made these mistakes continue to hold their positions. The companies that were the cause of this financial meltdown, these banks have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. We put in one major piece of legislation called Dodd-Frank. And that was designed to make sure that banks could not quite leverage themselves as far. There were some other things in there, including the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that have really helped a lot of people. So it was a good piece of legislation, but it didn't quite go far enough. Now, this week in the Senate, there is a bill that is working its way through the Senate with bipartisan support that is designed to weaken a lot of the regulations that were put in place by Dodd-Frank. This is a terrible idea. It's setting us up for another financial collapse. We cannot let that happen. So call your senators, do it today. Make sure they know that you do not support the bill to loosen restrictions on these big banks. It's all right if we want to do a little bit of loosening on the community banks, the local banks. That's going to help some lending in our local communities. I'm okay with that. And that's how this Senate bill started. But then they said, you know what? We should let Citigroup, one of the biggest banks in the world, we should let them play by these new rules too. It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. It's going to cause another collapse like the one we had in 2008. There's no two ways about it. So make sure your senator knows where you stand on that. And when I get to Congress, you better believe one of the first things I'm going to do is try and pass stricter restrictions on these big banks, try to break up these big banks, put in place a new Glass-Steagall Act so that the Wall Street banks at least aren't allowed to play around with your money, your financial savings that you're putting in local banks. That's what they're able to do now after the Glass-Steagall repeal. So there's a lot of things that we need to do to make sure that we're really regulating these banks and protecting ourselves from another great financial meltdown.